What PC parts are right for your workflow? And have deals between Apple, Kia, and Hyundai fallen through on the development of the Apple car? More today on the Tech Summit Podcast, episode 26. I'm Chris.
I'm Francisco.
And of course, if you are watching on YouTube, all that social media will be right here at the bottom of the video.
And as for other podcasting applications, such as if you're listening to us on any other apps besides YouTube, you can find all of our links down in the description, including the link to the Tech Summit Discord, so do make sure to stop by there.
Of course, that's right. Now, we have two subjects today. One that we weren't able to cover this past episode, but we're going to talk about today a little bit. And that is, of course, just PC parts based on people's workload. You have a whole lot you want to say about that, is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, I've compiled a list. So mostly like just what use cases we're going to tackle. And here I've actually got 6 different categories, though depending on how things go, maybe we could actually cut that down to 5, considering that it is kind of redundant for one of them. But the first one is going to be office work. Then we're going to move on to Photoshop and drawing. So, you know, those art students out there. And we've also got 1080p gaming and 4K gaming. We could probably put those two together and just have a discussion around PC gaming in general and just kind of like bring up the different, like the best parts for certain resolutions. And we have just video editing. So if you're going to be doing a lot simpler video editing, and we've got 3D animation, high-end video editing, which is if you're going to be doing much higher-end stuff overall. So if you're like a bougie art student, for lack of better word.
Someone who uses a lot of computing power, basically. Intense video editing, 3D animation, and maybe to a lesser extent deep learning, but a lot of that will use more specialty hardware, I'm guessing. So,
Sure. But we could probably put that in there too.
It's definitely on that higher end.
Yeah.
So in any case, get us started.
Sure. So category number 1 is going to be office work. So if you're an office worker, what's the best graphics card for you if you're going to be doing Microsoft Word and working with Excel sheets and things of the like?
GG1010.
I was actually going to say buy pre-built.
Okay.
But I guess that's just as good as of an answer. Though,
go ahead.
Yeah, I will say, yeah, like really just buy yourself a pre-built here. You don't want to spend any money on getting parts if this is all that you're going to be doing. Though I would argue that RAM is probably the biggest concern here, if anything. It could be, I think, because Excel sheets can get pretty big depending on what you're doing.
That's right. Excel can take up RAM.
It can, yes.
It can.
Wow. Think of it as the Chrome of productivity.
Now, my thing is, how much RAM does Excel really take up, though? You know, if a pre-built machine usually comes with maybe 4 or 8 gigabytes of RAM, we'll say, would that not be enough for most situations with Chrome and Excel open at the same time? Because, you know, that's what most these people are going to be doing.
Not 4 gigs, because 4 gigs is very much obsolete, I want to say, because Windows already takes up, I think, over 1 gig of RAM, if I'm not mistaken.
That's the thing I want to sort of ask you. We're talking strictly desktops, right? We're not talking any Chromebooks, no laptops, no tablets.
No, we can recommend all of these things of anything.
Okay.
Yes. Like if you think that one of these is a better pick for something like this, go for it.
Okay, because I'm thinking for the bottomest tier of like the basic office work in terms of like research. Again, college students, as I mentioned a couple episodes ago.
Yeah.
If you're doing research papers, things like that, a lot of web-based things or document-based stuff, I do think a Chromebook could do, at least for the short term.
Yeah, I would say that if your main focus is going to be word processing, like Microsoft Word, you always have things like Word Online. I'm not entirely sure if there is a specific application for Chrome OS for Microsoft Word, but
it's probably going to be Google stuff, Google Docs, Google Sheets.
Most likely, yeah. So if you're working with these applications, yeah, like you might as well go with the Chromebook. If everything else that you're going to be doing with your PC is maybe just going to be cloud gaming, maybe you are a Stadia gamer, or stop that. It is a serious platform. Anyway, Or if you're perhaps just going to be doing web browsing, maybe just watching Netflix on your time off or whatever, then yeah, the Chromebook, cheap $300, $200 Chromebook will get the job done just fine. Especially if you're going to be working on the web mostly, then might as well just get a Chromebook in that instance.
But the big idea is essentially that no matter what, if you're in this tier, you're most likely better off just buying pre-built things.
Yeah, I do very much think so because a lot of CPUs don't really have integrated graphics anymore, which means that you do kind of have to get a graphics card, but also it is kind of tough to find any unless you want a GT 1010.
Right.
But even then, because you still have to buy a legitimate Windows license, you still have to buy the RAM itself, the power supply, the motherboard, the case, all of these things. It's just going to be kind of inefficient when it comes to just like that price to performance ratio. You're not going to get the most out of it. It's definitely going to be overpriced.
And of course, we're talking about pre-built, but just so we're clear, someone who is just doing office work and who's looking for a pre-built should probably avoid Alienware brand, for example. Right?
Yes, of course.
If it's above $500-$600, you probably don't need it.
Right. Go for something lower than that for sure. If you're going to just be doing this kind of work, ultimately, 16 gigs of RAM should probably be the most that you're looking for, because you're probably going to want to get more monitors, if anything, versus needing extra horsepower on there. I just don't think that you're going to be benefiting much from a lot of
I was going to say, too, because, like, in this tier, I'm trying to figure out if in this tier also includes, say, for example, investors, with all that's been going on lately.
Right, yeah.
People who use multi-monitor setups. And we're talking multi-monitor, not two. We're talking, like, in some cases, as many as 6 different monitors all running at once. What tier do you put people like that in? Do you put them in this office tier, or do you put them a little bit above that?
Definitely above that, because at that point, most graphics card will support, like, up to 4 displays. From just like having four displays at one time connected to said graphics card. I'm pretty sure that if you use a splitter, you could probably make that work, but that's not really recommended. So at that point, you might actually want to look at a different solution. And I mean, some people might even say multi-GPU setups, which could work. I don't think that you need to have an SLI setup for that to actually work out. Like, you don't have to have the same graphics card for both. As long as you have 2 PCIe slots available, I think it'll be fine. But, yeah, like, you would be looking into wanting to invest more in that case, because you do need those 6 monitors. But let's say that 3 to 4 monitors are enough for you, then you can definitely afford to save yourself some money in that regard. But yeah, probably a GT 1010 might still be good enough.
I love that thing's existence. It's just
do you?
Yeah, the fact that it exists is just outstanding to me.
I dread it somewhat, but I think I see where you're coming from.
I want to meet someone who actually buys one for their custom build.
That's somebody that goes, I got 4 in my system, and I can run Excel at 144 frames per second.
Listen, man, 10 times 4, that's 40, okay? I'm next gen. I'm next gen.
Yeah, and we're not even there yet. So where are you with your ugly 3070 and your 3090?
You're still back in 2008. You're so 2000 late.
I love that quote.
We're abusing this one today.
Yeah, I just hope that we don't get a DMCA strike for that
one. Anyway.
No, we'll be fine. Don't worry.
So, of course, now, a lot of these people who are in that bottommost tier, that more budget-conscious thing, I imagine most of those people are not the audience that we are currently talking to.
Mostly, no.
We're going to be talking more creators, gamers, et cetera, et cetera. So... Yeah. Take us to the next tier.
Yeah, so let's move on to Photoshop/drawing. Since that is actually one that is not really as hardware intensive as a lot of people might think it is. Though a custom build might be nice, I think most people can still do just fine with an affordable pre-built tier. Of course, depending on your workload. Because if you're just drawing, then yeah, sure. Honestly, Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5 would be totally fine. Core i3, Core i5, mostly Core i5 would be totally fine for something like this. And even when it comes to graphical performance, you don't need anything crazy. So you can really afford to save yourself some money here. Though this is, of course, if we're talking about desktops, when it comes to laptops, nowadays, there is, like, the market is just so different now than what it was 4 years ago when it comes to laptops. When it comes to desktops, I would say that when it comes to drawing in Photoshop, it is more or less the same. Because here, like, the recommendations kind of remain the same, but if we're looking at laptops, in this case, you're probably still looking to either get a nicely built laptop that costs $1,000 or more to get at least hopefully like a quad-core i5, six-core i5, still with the wattage of a mobile processor. And yeah, well, there's that. Or you would look into getting yourself a budget gaming laptop, which can roughly cost you around $700 to $800 just with the worst build.
Or if we're talking about drawing and drawing on the go, surely the answer is an iPad.
I missed that point completely. So thank you for that. Yes, an iPad may
I thought that's where you were going, and you mentioned gaming laptop. I'm like, what?
No, yep. I completely missed that mark, and that's why I have you here.
No. If you're drawing on the go, you're doing portable, an iPad, surely. iPad with Procreate.
Even at home.
Even at home, yeah, sure. But if we are talking about desktops, I definitely think that, like you said, you don't really have to go super powerful on the PC specs. More than you should probably take that money and invest it into a good drawing tablet or a display monitor, even.
Okay, so actually, you could even save yourself quite a bit of money on that, since a lot of display tablets aren't really so expensive. Like if you go with the likes of Huion, for instance. Then yeah, I think you'll be just fine. It probably depends on what other tasks you're going to be doing as well. But if you're just doing if you're doing Photoshop and drawing, because Photoshop is in there, I probably still wouldn't solely recommend an iPad for that, because Photoshop is still quite limited on the iPad. I would recommend other apps.
Yeah, if we're talking about like digital photo editing and stuff like that, then yeah, we're talking about using a computer. But
yeah,
like
with a drawing display.
If you are specifically just drawing, like you are a 2D artist or anything like that sort, then an iPad with Procreate, not Photoshh, Procreate is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and there are even other apps as well that I can't really think of necessarily right now. Sketchbook. There was another one too, Clip Studio, that would be great options for drawing as well on the iPad. So hey, honestly,
and of course, we also have to put another disclaimer out here.
Sure.
All of this is very generalized sort of stuff. It doesn't really because of course, a more skilled artist might need a little bit more specialized hardware and software.
Yeah.
Compared to someone who's just starting out.
Yeah. For somebody that does want to get into digital art and things of the like, you really don't have to spend a lot of money on it, and a very simple display tablet will do. I know that most people don't really want to go for just a drawing pad, and I understand why. Luckily, there are plenty of affordable options that are like around the $200 range, where you will actually have a separate display for drawing and things like that, such as the Huion Canvas 13, which is going to be a great option. I think it runs for around $230. Things of the like. So you can definitely still afford to stay on a budget. And if you already have a computer that can handle Photoshop just fine, then you really just need that drawing display to go with it.
Essentially.
Yeah, and I think that you'll be just fine in that regard. Now, if you're doing much higher end stuff, we're going to get to that soon. But now let's talk about the gaming side of things. So let's add...
I forgot to do that for the Photoshop, guys. I am so sorry. Let's add another one there for our artists out there. Shout out to all the artists.
Yeah, I'm pressing F on the keyboard as well.
Yeah,
for you guys.
Sympathies.
Yeah.
Continue.
So, 1080p gaming, 1440p gaming, and 4K gaming. I actually kind of want to skip 1440p in a way and just go from 1080p to 4K gaming.
1440p does sort of seem like that middle ground, and I don't want to say that people will be able to figure it out, but we are very much kind of just like minimum stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like trying to generalize a little. So for 1080p gaming, it does still depend on what games you're going to be playing. But let's assume, for the sake of generalizing, that it is mostly going to be FPS games.
I would just say to include games from the last 5 years, we'll say. 5-10 years.
Okay.
Because, I mean, the first game that I am thinking of is Doom. And Doom is extremely well optimized, and it is an FPS.
Fair. I was immediately thinking just like Call of Duty. But
Call of Duty is also relatively well. I mean, Doom is definitely the example that I've been thinking of when it comes to PC gaming.
That's
and
fair.
Of course, again, Doom is legendarily well optimized for a lot of machines. So
yeah.
It does not require as high of a barrier to entry for compared to a lot of other games out there, like say Flight Simulator or Cyberpunk.
Flight Simulator. Now, I can certainly agree with that too. Whether you're playing the 2016 Doom or if you're playing Doom Eternal, you can run it on pretty old hardware still, and it would run just fine, especially if you're going to be playing it at 1080p. Now, one big difference here between 1080p gaming and 4K gaming is that 1080p gaming is mostly CPU intensive, and 4K gaming is a lot more GPU intensive. So that's why a lot of rigs can afford to go with a lower end graphics card if they're just going to be gaming at 1080p, as long as they have a decent CPU in there.
Right.
Yeah. So considering that 1080p is so easy to run, I want to say nowadays, like especially if you have a modern CPU, you can have a lower end graphics card such as even a 1063 gig, and you would have a pretty great time gaming at 1080p at higher resolutions. Well, I meant to say 1080p
at higher frame rates.
Higher frame rates, thank you. Higher frame rates, as long as you're willing to sacrifice quality a little bit, though that may not always be true. It depends on the game.
Listen.
Yeah?
No, you gotta finish.
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, no. I was just going to say, because there's a reason why the 1060 is the most commonly used card according to Steam, Steam Analytics.
Yeah.
There's a reason why it's still there and why people are still using it. It's just so good at handling most games from the past 10 or so years, let alone anything before that, easily. It can't support ray tracing, it can't necessarily do 4K, at least not too much 4K, once you reach the higher end.
You can watch films in 4K.
But say for example, if you're someone who is getting into PC gaming and is gravitating towards maybe the indie games, for example, easily.
Definitely.
And of course a lot of people do come to PC gaming specifically because of the indie market being so wide compared to like consoles.
And usually there is a very low barrier to entry when it comes to indie games in general too, because a lot of them do tend to be 2D side scrollers.
Yeah, 2D side scrollers, isometric things, roguelikes, top-down view stuff. Like most indie titles don't have the amount of like polygon density or like high-end graphical fidelity as something like a Cyberpunk or even a Doom. The only examples I can think of is Hellblade, which is technically a AA studio, and I will argue that this is technically an indie studio now. Hitman 3.
What?
With IO, because remember, IO is independent now. They're not published by Square Enix.
Oh, I guess that does technically.
If you want to get technical with it, they are in fact an indie studio. So Hitman is an indie game. In which case, Hitman, especially in 4K, we're definitely gonna need higher end stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Hitman is going to be a different kind of game, no doubt.
It is. It came out, remember?
Yeah.
Hitman is pretty intensive. So that's 1080p gaming essentially. Very.
Yeah, it is going to be very CPU based. So, in other words, to summarize things here, if you're going to be gaming in 1080p, very much just a Core i5 or a Ryzen 3 will do you just fine. And you could go with a lower end graphics card, 1050 Ti, 1063 gig, a 6 gig if you want to go a little nuts, but that's not really necessary. I think you're going to be just fine with a 1066 3 gig. Or if you want something a little more recent, a 1650 will do just fine. So yeah, that's my verdict when it comes to 1080p gaming. I think that you can get away with a lot if you're just gaming at 1080p. And now when it comes to 4K gaming, that's a different story because that's a lot more GPU intensive.
Right. And of course, we say 4K gaming. I also want to include VR as a part of this particular little tier.
Okay.
I think a lot of VR stuff can sort of slot into that theoretical 1440p tier that doesn't exist right now.
I would actually put that on high-end 1080p.
To a degree.
No, mostly.
I would say to a degree, because like the specs that you list, I wasn't too far off from them in my older PC, and I was experiencing frame dips with certain VR games after a point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because like with the Oculus, with the Rift S, I was like on the base floor of the minimum requirements for the VR headset, let alone any games. So like say for example, like I was getting frame dips playing Beat Saber or Super Hot. That's nothing to say about possible dips, which are absolutely inevitable if something like Half-Life Alyx was being played.
Right.
So I would put it closer to a 1440p tier, definitely in a 4K tier.
I see what you mean. Okay. I think that in that case, that should be a category of its own, but we should touch on that first, actually.
I mean, I definitely think if you want to do like stable, good VR gaming with like high fidelity graphics and stuff like that, like if you want to crank the graphics up to max while in VR, I think this 4K tier is more or less where most people are going to want to be comfortably, especially if the intention is to have that VR headset and to have it supported for a couple of years.
Sure, I can see that. A lot of 10 series graphics cards were actually considered VR ready. So because they had that label with them, even if you, like, it almost didn't really matter what VR game you wanted to play. Obviously, as long as you were willing to compromise quality a bit, you could very much still run it. Now, maybe a 1063 gig isn't so good here. I would certainly suggest a 1066 gig at the very minimum. And now if you have a 1070, 1080, now we're heading into much nicer, a lot more reasonable territory for VR games. Though, it's funny how the Quest 2 can run so many VR games with its mobile processor and integrated graphics and things of the like. So, like, it just makes you wonder, is the Oculus Quest 2 more powerful than a gaming PC from 4 years ago?
That's a video right there.
Yeah. Ooh, man, that's actually a great idea.
So, but yes, the 4K tier.
Yeah.
So this is where your Cyberpunks and stuff like that are going to be maybe-ish. Cyberpunk is definitely on the higher end still, but
yes, so Cyberpunk for sure. So when it comes to, again, 4K gaming, it is going to be mostly GPU intensive, but you do need a good CPU to go with it nonetheless, because you don't want any kind of bottlenecking to go there. The CPU and the GPU, for to put things very simply, they would need to be able to go neck and neck in a lot of ways. Like, one should be able to complement the other. So you do need high-end specs either way if you're going to be gaming in 4K. Now, if you're playing indie games in 4K, then you can't get away with
that.
Yes, no worries. I should probably give you an easier cue, actually, for transitioning.
It's okay. I'll follow through. I just gotta make sure I'm doing that. But continue.
No worries. So, 4K gaming, I don't want to recommend anything less than a 2080 Ti personally.
That's fair. That's extremely fair.
So you agree?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say so.
Okay. And when it comes to CPUs, I would not settle with an i5 or even a Ryzen 5. Ryzen 7 or Core i7 would be the way to go. From at least, I want to say, 8th gen i7 and onward should do you fine. But recommended, at least a Core, so Ryzen 7 would be the better choice here if you're gaming at higher resolutions. Though supposedly, when it comes to gaming performance, actually a Core i7 has been performing quite well if you're looking at the 10th gen i7.
Right. Now, with these 4K specs, are you also accounting for possible ray tracing support?
I suppose that you could, but if you want to play games in 4K with ray tracing on, please upgrade to a 3000 series.
30s, right?
Yeah, you want to look at the 30s, at least a
when
3070.
they're available.
Yes.
When they are available, that's 3080 Ti was supposed to come out this month, right?
Yes, that is still up for debate.
Okay.
Though like the 3060 Ti, I would not recommend a 3060 Ti for 4K gaming.
No.
A 3070 at the bare minimum if you're going to be doing 4K gaming and having ray tracing on top of that, because a 3070 is basically the equivalent of a 2080 Ti in a lot of ways or just like in overall performance, but there's still some things that the 2080 Ti has over the 3070, such as a higher VRAM count. And I believe it also has more CUDA cores. But the 3070 has more like second generation tensor cores or RT cores. One of the two, probably both.
Right.
And while it has less memory, it is a lot more efficient when it comes to ray tracing and things of the like. And considering that you also have a 3070 on your rig, I'm pretty sure that you can vouch for that since you specifically wanted a 4K monitor.
Yes. Yes, I specifically wanted a 4K monitor. And so far, just about every single game has run very well in 4K. Although a lot of the games seem to default to 1080p or even 1440 before I have to go in there and shift it to 4K.
Despicable.
I'm like, why does Night in the Woods look a little fuzzy?
That's why.
And then all of a sudden it pops. It looks fantastic.
Yeah.
Naturally, that runs at 60.
Yeah. Now, granted, you do have it paired up with a Ryzen 9 3950X, which is certainly on the higher end of things.
Yes.
You don't need that powerful of a CPU. I think that a Ryzen 7 just 3800X will do just fine.
Right. Yeah, no, when we're talking about CPUs that high, that's when we're starting to move towards the more work-based stuff, which will bring us to the next tier.
Next category, which is actually breaking away, and that is just video editing. Which means that we will be bringing ourselves back down and talking about an iPad Pro with LumaFusion.
Interesting. We're taking a swerve here.
Yeah, we are. So, again, it really does depend on what kind of tasks you're going to be handling. If you're going to be streaming games, like if you have that in mind, which actually should have been in category 2, my apologies. Maybe we'll touch on that in another episode because that could easily be an episode of its own.
Definitely, especially with all the equipment, the specialty equipment that you can get that's like separate from a PC itself.
Yes.
Maybe we should handle that next episode, honestly.
Yeah, sure.
Stay tuned.
I think that sounds great. So now, putting that aside, subscribe, follow. I think that if you're going to be video editing and just web browsing the rest of the time, maybe you are actually going to be doing some photo editing, some drawing here and there, or just like if you're mostly going to stay within the artistic side of things, an iPad Pro will be able to handle the vast majority of these tasks, and you can probably save yourself a lot of money along the way. And if you do want like a separate display to go with your iPad Pro, you can absolutely do that without many issues.
Right, but when we're talking about full-scale film or like actual like really, really intense video editing, we're talking about short films, Premiere, DaVinci, After Effects.
Yeah. If you do need After Effects or something for special effects,
builds.
You do need a desktop.
What do you need?
What you need in that case, I'm going to recommend some pretty high-end stuff because
that's where we're on the higher end.
Yeah. So going back to that, so now this was actually a category of its own because I did lump in 3D animation with high-end video editing together, but
splitting them a little bit.
Yeah, I guess if we can split them up here.
We'll split them a little bit.
So for high-end video editing, I'm going to be frank here. Like, let's say that you're going to be editing 4K footage, even 8K footage, 6K footage, just 4K and up. You want a very powerful CPU for sure, which is what I would recommend at the minimum, maybe a 3850X. So Ryzen 7, but even just the Ryzen 9 3900X.
Of course, if you're going that high, surely we can recommend that you go into the 50s series, the 5950X, for example.
Oh.
When that's available. Don't forget, those did release, technically.
Yeah.
They technically did release.
Well, they literally did, but I mean, a lot of people
I say technically in the sense that it was not on a store shelf. It's just, it was immediately snatched up.
Fair. I mean, there have been people that could still go to their local Micro Center and find some, but that's a dime. No, not a dime a dozen.
I would definitely say that for 4K footage because 6K and 8K are not that well used yet. Okay, so yeah, we have the Blackmagic Pocket can record in 6K, but you always downscale it to 4K, always.
Yeah.
Just because there's there's very few devices that can support 6K playback. And 8K playback is extremely out of most consumers' price ranges.
I would say get an 8K TV instead of an 8K monitor, because that would be cheaper.
$20,000 still.
Really?
For 8K TVs? Yeah, Sony 8K TV is like $20,000.
Oh, well, I mean, if we're looking at Sony, sure.
In general, 8K TVs are extremely expensive. We're talking well over $5,000 to $10,000.
I thought that there would be something along the $3,000 line.
Don't think so. Let's double check this. But continue with your video editing there.
Sure. In the meantime, now, when it comes to video editing, I've certainly come across a lot of hiccups. And I've had 3 separate builds for handling editing. Oh, I guess I was right.
He was right.
I was.
He was right.
Aha. So I guess if you do want an LG signature TV, you could spend $30,000 if you really felt like it. But
I mean, that's OLED and it's LG. I mean, is Samsung are Samsung TVs really that good though?
Yeah,
I've heard issues back and forth between them.
No, I mean they're really good.
Okay.
My father does prefer Sony though. In general, like if he could pick any brand, he would go with Sony. Me personally, I couldn't care less about what brand I go with when it comes to TVs. I just want one that works, because I'm a lot less picky when it comes to TVs and displays in general. I want to say, but I would say that still it looks like $2,000, $3,400 would do just fine if you want an 8K TV. So. If you do want to watch your films in 8K, that is indeed possible. But even then, still, like a TV isn't recommended for professional use. It's really just meant for entertainment. So I'm not seriously recommending that you go for an 8K TV instead of an 8K monitor if you're going to be doing work.
Nevertheless, the specs for 4K video editing in this instance, we're talking about advanced video editing, effects, 4K editing.
Yeah, usually high core count, multi-threaded CPUs are best. I'll give you an example. The 3950X has been fantastic for editing 4K footage with stabilization, color correction, sound effects, transitions, and things of the like. On my rig, I haven't had any hiccups whatsoever besides the software crashing, but that's actually not an issue with my hardware. It is just sometimes stability issues with software, especially if you're using Premiere. That's going to be pretty annoying. And if you're going to be doing work in After Effects and things like that, you do want that higher core count. But then if we're also talking about After Effects and things like that, higher RAM is usually preferred too. So either way, you can't really avoid spending a lot of money on this system because it is just going to be expensive all around.
Right.
So in this case, especially if you're working with After Effects, you do want a lot of RAM. 32 gigs is going to run out on you very quickly. Don't bother. 64, if you're going to be doing After Effects work. You could optimize After Effects so that it doesn't just chew through your RAM as quickly, but it will still start begging for your RAM right away.
Right.
It's so RAM intensive. It's insane. I would still actually have issues doing, again, like not making so complicated projects in After Effects on my previous rig with 64 gigs of RAM. I was still struggling when it came to 4K footage and even when I went down to 1080p footage. So do keep that into consideration. And right now, the 3950X is handling all of these things just fine, and I did upgrade to 128 gigs. But I think that 64 gigs should be a minimum if you're going to be doing serious After Effects work.
Yes.
Any thoughts?
No, I don't disagree whatsoever. I'm not as familiar with After Effects quite yet. I'm still learning that one very much. So
okay, I'm
not fully integrated. I don't have that many detailed thoughts, honestly, on that one.
So what happens when we move up to 3D rendering and 3D animation, things like that? Sounds like you have a lot of thoughts. Go for it.
I don't have any thoughts.
You don't have any thoughts?
Okay, so
you do that.
All right, no. I'm sure you have this stuff actually written down. You are the tech expert here.
I don't have these things written down so much, actually.
And you know what I mean? And you already have an idea in your head when it comes to 3D stuff. But if you want my input of all people,
yours is the most important.
For whatever reason, keeping in mind that we're talking into levels that I'm not as familiar with, because at this point, we all know what my build is. My build is a 3070, 3950X, 64 gigs RAM.
Right.
That can actually be considered low end for 3D.
Fair.
In some cases, depending on exactly what you're trying to do, it could actually even be considered shovelware garbage.
Fair.
If we're talking about 3D modeling and animation, of course, you have to keep in mind, like all of these other tiers, there's a lot of different layers and facets, and things change a little bit depending on what you want to do with it.
Yeah.
Naturally. Sculpting, for example, versus animation, texturing versus lighting. Like there's going to be some differences. In general, however, if you want to do higher end 3D work without too many issues, Threadripper. You need a Threadripper.
Okay.
Now,
current gen Threadripper, by the way, don't get even a first generation Threadripper because just the name itself is not enough. If you look at the specs, older generation Threadrippers can actually be as powerful as current generation Ryzen 9s.
Yeah, no. There's a lot of different factors at play here when it comes to this stuff. And yeah, older Threadrippers aren't really that much more powerful than, say, the 3950X, for example. There was a Threadripper that was actually weaker than the 3950X while costing several $100s more.
Yeah.
So you want to do your research on that. But if you want to go high end, I know we've been focusing a lot on like the minimum for a lot of these things.
Yeah.
And again, you could say that I count for minimum. So if you want to go like minimum of like, oh, I can do 3D with this, go with what I have. 3950X, 3070, 64 gigs RAM. Those are the important things.
Yes.
But if you want to go high-end 3D, especially if you're doing CPU-based rendering, Threadripper 3990X. That is a nearly $4,000 CPU. Extremely, like the CPU itself costs more than my PC and almost costs as much as yours.
Right.
Okay.
It's a bit of a flex, but only a bit.
But for CPU rendering, that is what you want because we are talking so many cores, 64 cores and 128 threads, all maxed out, keeping in mind that a lot of the speeds that they get right now is before you overclock it.
Yeah.
In which case, of course, you need serious cooling. We're talking probably liquid cooling in this instance at that point.
It is dependent. Liquid cooling can be more consistent, but air cooler can still perform better. It does depend. But usually when it comes to overclocking, liquid cooling is preferred.
Right.
For the reasons that it is more consistent.
Right. Which, by the way, of course, you also have Intel's equivalent. What is that? Xeon.
Yeah, Xeon.
The Xeon brand. That those are also really good ones, or they can be really good ones. This is where things get a little testy here because we have to talk about performance ratio because you have a lot of these CPUs and GPUs, by the way, of course, GPUs. Because if you want to talk GPUs, then the recommendation is going to be Quadros, NVIDIA Quadros.
Usually, though, you also do have like the affordable Quadros, like the cheaper ones that are like around $500 or so. Yeah. Don't get those really because those are meant for something else,
and that's where it comes down to price to performance ratio.
Yeah,
like these cards, Quadros. In the case of CPUs, Threadrippers, and Xeons, those are marketed specifically for this heavy intensive workload stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't always necessarily mean that they are the better alternative to a Ryzen CPU or a RTX card.
Right.
Just because, they'll always price gouge a little higher because it's for work as opposed to recreation, like a lot of those other things are for,
Yeah.
So, I realize I'm kind of sidetracking all around the place instead of just focusing on the minimum stuff like you've been doing. And I'm sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
Maybe I'm just deeply flexing a little bit on just how much is required for 3D stuff, I guess.
No, go for it.
In comparison to a lot of the other things. 3D is arguably one of the most intensive things that you can do with a computer next to deep learning and AI stuff.
Yeah.
So that's another thing too. A lot of this higher end 3D stuff is also what you're going to necessarily want if you want to try to do something like deep learning or, of course, cryptocurrency mining. And even then, cryptocurrency mining, it costs more in electricity than it makes out in profit from mining.
Yeah, it may not be profitable.
We would not recommend that you do that right now.
Right.
But in any case, again, it obviously depends. If you're going to be doing CPU rendering, you're going to want to emphasize the CPU. If you're planning on doing GPU rendering, you're going to want to emphasize the GPU.
Yeah.
If you're doing a lot of particle effects and simulation-based stuff, you might want to prioritize the CPU and the RAM. In the end, you want to strike depending on your budget, you want to strike a balance between those three things. My balance came down to 64 gigs RAM, 3950X, and a 3070.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to have that nice clean balance, because I haven't done GPU rendering yet, but I'm keeping my mind open for it because GPU rendering tends to be a lot faster, even if it comes at the expense with a little bit of noise quality or maybe lesser reflections, whatever it may be.
Okay.
But because I haven't done that yet, I also want to have a CPU that can at least hold its own on some of the stuff. People haven't seen it because I don't plug my social media at the bottom yet, but maybe you saw on my Instagram the Diamond Hands piece that I put out.
I was told about it. I haven't seen it, though.
Yes, the Diamond Hands piece. That was about 90 minutes to render on the CPU because of how many reflections there are, because, it's Diamond Hands, so it's reflecting all over the place multiple times. And, of course, if you up the anti-aliasing sampling, that means that it's getting those samples all over here multiple times over, depending on how many times you do. We talk about thousands of different passes or whatever it may be.
So we're talking about a single image here, right?
We're talking about a single image. Yeah, that's 90 minutes for a single frame. If that was somehow an animation,
it would have taken way longer.
Yeah. There's a reason why for a lot of 3D animation stuff, they usually tend to use server computers that are specifically built for rendering.
Yes.
Rendering machines, supercomputers with multiple GPUs or multiple CPUs put in there.
Yes. To
put into perspective, we're going to travel back a decade.
Okay.
Because this is usually the film that I know about with the numbers and stuff like that. Transformers 3. Which, say what you want about the quality of the movie and story and all that stuff.
I like the film.
But it is a visual effects feast.
Yes.
It is a visual effects feast.
Yeah. And
there was that one particular scene. I want to make sure that I have the actual numbers properly here. Yes, one particular scene here, which was the weird centipede worm thing that was going through the city, and Optimus had to try and fight it.
Yeah.
To render that, it took over more than 200,000 hours of rendering power per day. The entire render farm of Industry Light and Magic, which, of course, remember, Industry Light and Magic is always on the cutting edge of visual effects technology.
Okay.
Like, they have stuff that is well beyond what is usually available for consumer grade.
Oh, I see.
And they had to use the entire rendering farm, and we were talking more than 200,000 hours of rendering power a day, equivalent to 22.8 years of rendering time in a 24-hour period.
22.8 years of rendering time.
Done in one day. That's how much computing power that they had to use in order to get some of the stuff. And I think that was one shot specifically.
Wow.
That was, in fact, that shot maybe? No. That was just the entire movie, I think it was. There you go.
Okay.
For Devastator here, the worm thing, it's 72 hours per frame.
70, wow.
Per frame.
3 days per frame.
3 days per frame, 24 frames per second.
Dude, it'll take... How long is that actually?
Excuse me. I'm messing up on this podcast.
Tell me.
That was for the Devastator in Revenge of the Fallen, the second movie.
Oh.
The one with the cannonballs. The one with the cannonballs, yeah. For the worm there, it was 122 hours per frame. Excuse me.
24 frames per second.
And for the most complex scene, which was this driller destroying a skyscraper, it was 288 hours per frame.
Oh. Though that was for Transformers 3.
That is for Transformers 3.
Yeah,
and
which is a very old film at this point.
I was going to say, that's a decade ago.
Yeah.
But of course, the computing technology may increase, but the visual effects do the same.
Yeah.
I tend to use Transformers Dark of the Moon here as the example because we have those definitive numbers. If I find numbers for a more up-to-date film, like an Avengers or something like that, I'll be sure to bring them over here to you guys, maybe next week or something like that.
Sure, though I would think that Avengers still wouldn't be quite as intensive when it comes to rendering power.
You'd be surprised because so much of Avengers is based on visual effects.
Fair, yeah.
You know, like the entire villain, for example, is CG.
Yeah.
You know, like Like, say, for example, the scene where everyone's coming out of the portals, for example, I imagine that was an extremely intensive scene.
Yeah.
I'm going to imagine. I could be wrong. Transformers is very intensive because you have the reflections, you have all of the moving parts of these Transformers.
Yeah.
In the case of the skyscraper one, you have the glass shattering all over the place, and that has its own reflections.
Mm-hmm.
All that takes up a lot of rendering time, and that's why they use these supercomputers. So if you're trying to do 3D work, I am talking specifically 3D rendering.
Yeah.
Because if you're just doing 3D sculpting, for example, if you're just sculpting in something like ZBrush or whatever,
yeah,
my PC will do just fine. And going backwards again, iPad with Sculptura or Forger can actually hold its own pretty well with 3D sculpting, at least doodling and stuff like that, before you transfer it over to a stronger computer for ZBrush detailing.
Yeah, like there would just be the requirements here would be a lot different when it comes to just modeling and sculpting versus actual animation.
To a degree, of course, because if you're sculpting and you sculpt to higher and higher and higher levels to get that like extreme detailing in, you're talking about millions of polygons that you're working with, and that's going to take up a lot of RAM.
Yeah.
So
you'll eventually reach the ceiling.
I will say, if you're just starting out, 32. But if you want to be able to feel comfortable in something like ZBrush or whatever, I still say 64 is the way to go. But yes, I am definitely talking specifically in terms of, I am specifically talking the higher end stuff in terms of like rendering, simulations, effects, and stuff like that.
Right, like if you're working in feature films and things like that.
No, even advertising and stuff like that. Like, say, for example, if you want to do water simulation with Bifrost in Maya, for example, that is a lot of power that is required because for something like Bifrost simulating water, that is millions upon maybe even billions of little particles that are being combined into that body of water.
I see.
So you're taking particle simulation and you're like 100-folding it for something like water and oceans, for example.
I see.
You know, Pirates of the Caribbean also likely took loads of power and rendering. And just in general, the film being extremely expensive because they actually filmed a lot of it on water itself. And, you know, that's expensive. That's movie budget stuff. That's a separate thing entirely. Maybe someday when there's a Slow News Day, we could talk about movie budgets and the visual effects and all that stuff. But
is it Caribbean or Caribbean?
Tomato. Either or.
I don't know how I feel about that, but I suppose I'll figure that out.
If I'm talking about the region, I say Caribbean, but when I'm talking about the movies, I say Caribbean.
You see, I do too, but I battled with whether or not that is actually the right pronunciation for it.
I think for the most part it is Caribbean, but again, for the movie, it just makes more sense to say Caribbean.
It sounds better.
Pirates of the Caribbean? I don't know.
It rolls off the tongue better
Pirates
to say
of the Caribbean.
Caribbean, yeah.
Maybe it's the white way of saying
it. We're not a social commentary channel.
No.
Just
that's just the soccer mom from the Midwest. I want to go on Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, there you go.
That's what it is.
Yes.
But oh my, we are running very long today.
We are. So with that said, maybe we should leave those songs for next time. We'll hold the car
stuff for next time as well, yeah.
Yeah, we did get very excited talking about hardware, so
there's
do
a
forgive
lot
us.
of hardware stuff, of course.
Yeah, and we do still want to dedicate an episode to talking about streaming hardware and things like that, but hopefully this episode, I should say, because not everybody's watching this in video format.
That's right.
You'll be listening to this, yeah. Hopefully this episode was useful to you, and if you have any questions, then do make sure to leave them down in the comment section. And if you're listening,
I mean, of course, it is of course like a little starting base sort of thing. It's not a minimum stuff. In the case of 3D, it was very much maximum, but
yeah, none of this was really like objective. Really, I want to say this is just from personal experience and the things that could work. And for the most part, we were just recommending minimums until we went all out. But
we did,
yeah.
But of course, we do have to end the episode time. At this point, we're restarting the song.
I knew it. Don't worry, soon that won't be an issue.
That's right. There is going to be a new theme song now, won't there?
A new intro, yeah.
Yes, new intro, new theme song, new all of that stuff. So enjoy the song while it lasts.
I'm looking forward to ending this song for good. But with that said, thank you very much for joining us.
If you guys are watching on YouTube, we have the social media right down over here.
If you're listening,
if
you're listening, then everything's just going to be in the description of whatever app you are using.
Of course.
So, with that said, this has been Francisco.
And Chris.
And we'll be seeing you all on episode 27.
Next time.
Enjoy.
Good night. Travel well.
If you travel.
Maybe don't travel right away.